Welcome back to Your Voice, Your Future. I'm Armstrong Williams, your moderator. Kenneth Taylor, you are a 35-year recovery addict. I'm sure you have so many stories to share. What is the one thing that people don't learn about addiction that continues to repeat itself? And if you could change anything about those who are addicted to drugs or those that have come out rehab and making sure they don't have a relapse, what would you share?
Well, first off, I'd like to say thank you for having me on your show. The first thing that I would tell them would be to stay connected with people that are in recovery, so that they could have someone that they could talk to, that they can trust, that can help them get through the hard times that they may be going through trying to stay sober.
How did you end up, what triggered your addiction and at what age?
I was 13 when I started.
What was your addiction?
Well, I started off drinking liquor, and then it kind of escalated. I started smoking cigarettes and started smoking marijuana, and then it just progressed on to different drugs. By the time I was 18, I was shooting heroin.
You know, 35 years is a long time. Have you really conquered all your addictions, or do you still struggle?
No, I don't struggle. At this point in my life and in my recovery, I see myself as a person that just doesn't use any mind and mood altering substances.
What was the breaking point for you?
Well, being homeless, unemployed, unemployable. I had a friend of mine that asked me one time, did he think that we were destined to live like that? And I had to think about it because I never thought about it before. And my answer was, no, I don't think I was destined to live like this. I'm gonna stop. I don't know when, I don't know how, but I'm gonna stop. And the week later, I was in treatment.
But you would admit the drugs that are in the market today are far more lethal and dangerous than when you came along.
Oh, yeah. I probably wouldn't be here if I was using what they were using.
You know, how long were you homeless?
I was homeless, well, it was a very short time, about 6 months.
Was the marketplace forgiving once you faced reality and changed your behavior? Were you able to find unemployment, or do you still live with a stigma?
No, I don't live with the stigma. I was able to find employment. I actually got re-employed to my employer, who told me when he fired me that I would never work there again. And upon recovery, I just decided one day I'd just go ask and see if they'd give my job back. I mean, all they could say was no. Then I would know I'd never get my job back. But it didn't work out like that. I ended up retiring from that place.
What was it in your family background or your environment that led to so many addictions early on in your life? I mean, 13, you were still a kid, man.
Yeah, well, I grew up in a pretty violent environment, and I didn't think that I was supposed to. I just needed an outlet. I needed something that would make me feel good. And I got introduced to alcohol, and it made me feel good.
Well, where were your parents?
My parents were there. My father drank a lot.
Mm-hmm.
He was pretty violent. So I didn't want to really stay at home, so I just hung out in the streets.
You know, Abe, you're a former prosecutor. I know that you're a candidate for Congress in Arizona. That's not the reason why we invited you on, by the way. We invited you because you have some experiences along the way to share. When you hear stories like Kenneth, and you see what's going on in the world today, I mean, here's the guy for 35 years to overcome his addiction. How do you, the prosecution, when do you give people second chances? When do you know they won't go back into that same addiction? What can we learn from the court system as it relates to these issues of addiction?
To know how much more dangerous the drugs are nowadays compared to the past. But as a prosecutor, for us at the Maricopa County Attorney's Office while I was there, under Arizona law, we didn't actually jail people for their first time use, second time use, or even their third time use. So, they had to come through the legal system multiple times. And a lot of it requires outside help, family help, and resources from the community, which a lot of times they lack. So it's really, it's a multifaceted effort right now. But what I really look at as, the drugs that are coming across our border, I think that's the main culprit, because so much of the drugs have gotten cheaper in pricing. When I was a prosecutor, it was heroin. Heroin was really a big thing in the legal system, in the courts. I would constantly see cases come across my desks to prosecute heroin cases. But now, then it eventually moved on to meth. And as the price of meth decreased, then you saw fentanyl rise. And it used to be fentanyl was kind of a more sophisticated drug. It was about $20 a pill, and now you're seeing it about $2 a pill. So as the price of the market determines it, because of so many of these addicts, it really is heartbreaking, because so many people, a lot of folks don't realize they're probably your neighbors who have addiction problems with drugs. It's no longer just the inner cities. It's really gone into the suburban areas and the rural areas as well. So that is what's really shocking. And to see fentanyl on the rise like never before, where it's 50 times more lethal than heroin and 100 times more lethal than morphine. So it's become worrisome, because you're exactly right. The drugs have become more lethal through time, and the cartels and China with supplying the fentanyl, it's really hurting the American people. And I think we have to get a lot tougher on our border, because that's where a majority of the drugs come through our southern border.
Talk about how these drugs travel, and it's not always necessary that it's people who are seeking these drugs. Sometimes people are at parties or hanging with friends, and they try to convince them to try this pill, try this drug, and they have no idea that it's been laced. They have no idea they could have a heart attack, they could die. They just have no idea and trust in others, and sometimes total strangers, because they're into an environment where they're having fun and they're trying different things. But talk about how this drug has traveled and has become so devastatingly destructive and a killer.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And, there were reports last year about the drugs, the fentanyl coming in, and how they were labeled like as candy, right? They were multicolored, so it was almost targeting high schoolers and children. And there's a lot of accidental drug overdoses here in Arizona. We had just had one tragically just last week, where a baby infant was killed because they got their hands on a fentanyl pill. So and it's easy to digest also, and that's what's really scary, because the synthetic fentanyl, I want people to understand, when we talk about fentanyl, there's two types. There's pharmaceutical, and there's also the synthetic. And the pharmaceutical ones, they're not lethal unless it's like in high doses. But what's really scary is what you're saying is the laced fentanyl, where it's mixed in with other drugs, and that accounts for about 70% of the fentanyl overdoses. So, and right now you have a lot of these folks targeting the youth. And I think they're targeting them because it does get them high, and it affects their it's almost like a party drug. It's not the same as ecstasy, how it used to be back in the day. We don't see too many ecstasy cases anymore. But with fentanyl, it's kind of a catch-all drug. So that's why it's become so popular. But they do target the young, and that's why when you're seeing so many of the drug traffickers coming across, they tend to be young drug dealers, actually. And it's because of the cost of the drugs are so cheap right now.
Dr. Donohue is our residential physician. You heard the story from Kenneth, you've heard the stories from Abe. Talk about what's in these drugs, why they become so lethal, and why people become so addicted addictive to the point that they cannot live without them?
Well, good evening, Armstrong, and thank you for including me in this conversation. And the narrative that Ken and Aidan have provided so far really is a perfect segue. You think about this, that, that the hazard of drug use now has gotten so much more than was the case, as Ken pointed out, during his youth. This fentanyl is something that really is a beast of its own design. So fentanyl is a medicine which is called lipophilic. What that means, it goes to every nook and crevice and cranny of your body. It's absorbed very rapidly. We heard Aidan point out that the potency of this drug is phenomenal. It binds quickly. Lipophilic drugs go to the brain and take up residence there. Fentanyl does it in a matter of seconds. I have been doing heart cath for the last, I'm embarrassed to say, 35 years, and have used fentanyl daily. And it's a wonderful drug when dosed in micrograms. So when it's laced, as the prosecutor was pointing out, so oftentimes fentanyl is laced with other drugs, and it's off by a factor of 100. Okay, so the lacing is really a tremendous new source of death. If you think this through, in 2013, there were about 3,000 fentanyl deaths. In 2022, there were 73,000 fentanyl deaths. So ask yourself, what human malady has had that rate of rise? None that we can think of. And it's very much the case, as our prosecutor from Maricopa pointed out, very much the case that there are effectively no barriers to entry at the southern border now. So this is nothing other than a kind of invasion that has beset us. It is the case, tragically, as we've heard from both speakers, that very often unsuspecting people end up in this tar pit, and that's because these drugs are often laced with other drugs such as benzodiazepams. And I think probably every one of your viewers tonight, Armstrong, can think of someone in their own immediate sphere of influence who has died of this.
Hold that point, Doctor. Oh, yes, no question. Die now as we speak. This is your voice, your future. I'm your moderator, Armstrong Williams. My guest and I will be back after these commercial breaks. And welcome back to the broadcast. Kenneth, I am curious to know, even though you've overcome your addiction, what toll has it taken on your body and your health and other issues that you will deal with for a lifetime because of your past addiction?
Well, my memory isn't that great today. I had some liver problems, but they're taken care of. I'm a veteran, so that helped. That helped with insurance when I first got sober, because I didn't have any health insurance. But that's pretty. I guess I was pretty lucky that I didn't have a lot of health issues as a result of my using.
But you work with many people now who are confronting addiction. What have you learned from them in their struggles?
Well, what I've learned is a lot of people don't know where to go to get help. And like me, myself, I didn't know of any resources that was out there other than treatment centers. But we need more than that. than treatment centers. We need to deal with the psychological aspect of our addiction and the problems that we might have had before we started using. It's just a lot of things that we need to do in order to put our lives back together. And trying to find the resources is very hard.
You know, Abe, one of the things that we don't talk about enough when we read and listen to broadcasts and the crimes and just the level of the viciousness and the violence, and you say to my God, how could you do such a thing? And what sometimes we don't process is how these drugs impact the minds and your ability to discern oftentimes what you're doing, what it turns you into. Sometimes it's, Abe, you become a monster and don't realize it until the drug has worn off and the damage has been done.
Yeah, you're exactly right. I would have cases come across my desk, Armstrong, where the most unsuspecting people became addicted to it. You know, sometimes they did, start off with pharmaceuticals and they wanted to catch a high, but it's not always what you think, right? Where I would oftentimes have people who started to get addicted in their 30s, so it's not always the case that you start off young. So when you have that ability for this drug to really damage the body, but it takes a much more of a toll, not only on that person, but on the family who has to now spend their time and resources to make sure that their family member is getting treatment, or they have to check on them to make sure they're not dead, because it is really tough once they become addicted. They are always trying to catch that next high. And as a doctor pointed out, these drugs are getting really aggressive in terms of the effects on the mind that they have. But oftentimes people will spend their life savings to catch that high, and that's why they end up homeless, and they will be on the streets, and the drugs that they encounter on the streets are the ones that are most likely to be lethal, the ones that are most likely to have the fentanyl laced with other pills. So it becomes much more dangerous. But that's why I always go back to the root cause. I think when it's heroin, then meth, and then now it's fentanyl. A lot of it, especially with the fentanyl right now, it's coming through our southern border, Armstrong, and to have this border invasion with the drugs that are now going through Arizona, through the rest of the country, really damaging all of these cities, it becomes a big problem. And that's why I'm so shocked that the border situation is what it is, and the federal government doesn't seem to be taking action on it, because the Mexican drug cartels, this is a huge business operation for them. They're profiting off the expense with the lives of Americans, and it's really disheartening to see, and I hope our government takes action on it.
Well, let me give you an opportunity to plug the fact that you are running for congressman in Arizona, because I assume this is a big part of your platform.
Absolutely. I mean, border security is one of the top issues here in Arizona because we live with the effects of it daily. That's why I'm running for Congress, and I was just endorsed by President Donald Trump on Friday, so I'm greatly honored for that. But, this is where
why are you proud that you're endorsed by former President Donald Trump? Please explain that.
Well, under his leadership, Armstrong, we saw the world a much safer place. We're seeing what's going on overseas, whether it's Ukraine or Israel. We saw what's going on here domestically when we actually had a secure border. We didn't have tens of thousands of illegals coming across and all the drugs coming across our southern border. So the country was prosperous under President Trump. It's really a common sense decision, I think, if people actually look at if your life was better under this administration or the last administration. So once people really sit down and think about what the future holds for us, I think they want President Trump's leadership back in the White House. So that's why I'm honored.
Find it fascinating that people running as GOP candidates find it necessary to tell our national audience that Donald Trump has endorsed me and have my support, as if that's the hand of the Pope blessing you, and therefore it should be easy sailing to your winning office. But, it's fascinating because over the last couple of years, 95% of the candidates Donald Trump has endorsed has lost. And those GOP candidates that did not embrace Donald Trump have won. What do you say to that?
In Arizona, he has a perfect endorsement record, at least in the primary, Armstrong. But
I got you.
and
Okay.
it's, you know, quite frankly, I'm honored because, you know, I ran for attorney general last election, and a lot of it had to do with what we're discussing now with the border situation, the drug overdoses, the mental health crisis. So now running for Congress, taking that platform to Washington D.C., you know, fighting alongside some strong conservative fighters will be a great honor.
Well, I think if you win, you'll win because of your record and your integrity and what you've done to make a difference, not necessarily because Donald Trump is endorsing you. That's my point. You know, Dr. Donohue, as a world-renowned cardiologist, because I sort of asked this of Ken, can you explain the health impacts of fentanyl abuse on individuals and what medical challenges are posed by this crisis?
Yes, you know, Armstrong, we were just talking about the border invasion, but I want to just pose something else to you and our viewers, which is the demand side of this equation. So it's clear to see that the borders are open and this is a gushing torrent of these toxic products. But it's also important that we take a long look in the mirror and ask ourselves, why are we craving all of these things? Why is it that sobriety is no longer something that we clutch to and aspire to maintain, as Ken, I think, movingly pointed out once he regained his own sobriety? And so part of this is the contagion, that's the drug, but part of it is the host, that's us. And so we as a population are now much more avid consumers of this. Why would that be? And I would argue that as we have abandoned the scriptures, as we have abandoned the premise of children being raised with a married mother and father, as the family has dissolved, all of these kind of pestilences have found their way into our everyday life. The impact that this has on the body is immediate and enduring. So unlike the other, morphine gets its name from the Greek god of sleep, Morpheus, and it's really just more of a sedative. This is a different product. It has a clear euphoriant effect. So it creates a very powerful, almost bliss-like experience. It's also a very potent analgesic. It reduces pain. So all those things make it just a perfect substance for people who maybe are otherwise longing and empty. And part of our conversation has to be about us, what it is we need to do to restore as a population our own sovereignty, our dignity, our self-sufficiency. And I think that means going home to the Word of God. Remember, as Peter said, it's important that we be sober and serious. And so those are kind of premises that we've been very willing to abandon lately. And here comes this, along with other pestilences that really reflect to some extent our own weakness. So we need to begin the conversation by saying, let's regain our sovereignty.
You know, Ken, did moral striving, a deeper faith and a belief in something greater than yourself, did it play a role in your overcoming your 35 years of addiction?
Yes, it did. Not in the beginning. In the beginning, it was getting around people that had been through what I was going through and have gotten through it in their lives that became better. And getting with them and asking them what it was they did, and how did they do it, and trying their suggestions. My life started changing. And I came to believe that what was happening was God was working in my life through those people. So I did come to believe in God, and come to learn some morals, some values, some traditions, and that's what I live by today.
Abe, you have a strong background in military intelligence. The president of Ukraine is in Washington, D.C., Zelensky. As a candidate running for Congress in Arizona, where do you fall on the issue of more funding to Ukraine?
I believe right now what you've been seeing over the past 2 years of this war, where it's gotten us and where it's gotten Ukraine, I think, Washington seems to be, a lot of the American people are not sure why we are supporting Ukraine at this moment when there are so many issues going on in our own country, like our wide open southern border, especially if we're talking about protecting the territorial sovereignty of Ukraine. Well, our border is being invaded clearly, but with the drugs and with the human trafficking and with all the illegal immigrants. So I think we got to get our priorities straightened out right now. So I am not in favor of more funding to Ukraine. I think they need to have a peaceful negotiation, and I'm opposed to war, and I don't want to see American soldiers go and sacrifice their lives for something that right now, when we have so many other issues here at home.
Dr. Donohue, I'm going to wrap this provocative segment with you. What are the long-term ramifications with these weight loss medications, and do common medications for high blood pressure carry also long-term risk?
So, Armstrong, the jury is still just a little bit out on the first part of your question. So the two common weight loss medicines that you're talking about have just taken over, and they work. But that doesn't answer the question that you pose. What are the long-term implications? So since we don't have long-term experience, we can't with confidence answer the question. Here's what appears to be the case. When you stop Ozempic, you regain the weight that you lost with some dispatch, meaning quickly, and usually about 20% more. So that kind of turns the medicine into a bit of a lifetime premise. There's also a little bit of a concern, and I can't quantify this for you, but there's a little bit of a concern of a rather dastardly disease called medullary thyroid cancer. So it's on the one. So it's like everything else. You pose the benefit that you might incur as opposed to the risk that you experience. And so far, we're on the blissful phase of that curve, where we're all seeing weight loss. We're seeing true early satiety. So leptin is a hormone that gets manipulated, and you really are satisfied after just a third of what you ate previously. Antihypertensives, on the other hand, are wickedly underutilized. So when rightly chosen, antihypertensive therapy is like water for your desperate thirst. There's nothing but goodness about it when rightly chosen. So most Americans are hypertensive by ideal standards. A recent study, as of 2 weeks ago, pointed out that our goal for treating blood pressure should be in the 110 millimeter mercury range. Everybody now think, what was your last blood pressure? One of the things to think about in not being at goal is dementia. So the brain likes to be left alone. It doesn't like to be thumped and bumped. It wants to be in its own sacred space. Keeping that blood pressure low is a way of maintaining your own cognitive intactness.
Dr. Donohue, it's so unusual seeing you dressed like a businessman and not in your physician uniform. Sharp, I might add. But look, Ken, we wish you well. Thank you so much for being so open and sharing your story. Abe, we wish you well. This country certainly needs leaders that have vision and not compromise, and who are willing to serve the people, not their own interests. So we pray that you're that candidate. And Dr. Donohue, it's always a pleasure to have you on. When we return, Bruce Fein and Robert Hillard and I will return to talk about the legal system, the courts, Mr. Trump himself, Hunter Biden, and much more on this edition of Your Voice, Your Future Town Hall.
It is easier to build up strong children than to try and repair broken men.
The streets are plagued with crime, violence. There's a lot of poverty, and it's all a result of lack of education that's happening in our schools. So it really is a crisis.
We come from very different political perspectives, but we've come to the same conclusion, and that is there is a crisis in the classroom. Children are being deprived of quality of life because they're being deprived of a good education. We must solve this problem. It's incumbent upon all of us to join hands together to get this done.
We can't afford to wait one more day before we address these issues, because every day we lose another child.
Let's stop the politicking. Let's stop the games. Let's really do something to give these kids a real chance at life and being a part of that American dream.
We need accountability for funding. Many of the districts where you're seeing very low test scores, students graduating with very low literacy and math comprehension rates, they are receiving a lot of funding. So where is the money going where our kids aren't being adequately educated?
If you believe every child is deserving of a quality education, please go to educationjusticefoundation.com. And welcome back to the broadcast. Bruce Fein, let me welcome you to the broadcast. It's always a pleasure having you. And Robert Hillard, how are you doing, brother?
Outstanding. Thank you so much.
It's good. You know, it's fascinating that Hunter Biden filed to dismiss his indictment on gun charges. What do you read into that?
Well, there's a serious question as to the constitutionality of the underlying statute and the Hunter Biden gun charges. The question as to whether or not it is even illegal for an individual to, or whether under the Hillard decision, an individual can be deprived of the right to apply for a gun license just because of their condition of drug addiction. That's an open constitutional question that has not been decided by the courts. So there are actually many cases that may indeed end up being overturned once that works its way to the Supreme Court. Hunter Biden's lawyers are arguing that the cases of this nature are nearly never prosecuted for that exact reason, and that is a very difficult to prove charge in the interim, and that it may be overturned by the courts later on. So I think that what Hunter Biden's lawyers are doing are saying that don't make him the test case. Allow this to work its way through the appeals courts to the Supreme Court before hitting him with a felony charge for something which may or may not even be constitutional in the first place.
You know, Bruce Fein, the Supreme Court said just today it will consider special counsel Jack Smith's request to fast-track consideration of Donald Trump's claim he is immune from prosecution for alleged election obstruction in 2020, intensifying the legal jockeying over whether Trump's criminal trial in the nation's capital will stay on schedule for early next year. Now, the decision by the nation's highest court, which you're aware, doesn't mean that justices would definitely short-circuit the typical appeals process, but it means they're going to hear arguments from both sides about whether they should act quickly. Trump's lawyers were told to file briefs on the issue by December 20th.
Yes, the court can move very, very fast when the presidency is at stake. You may recall in Bush v. Gore, they issued their opinion one day after oral argument, December 12th of 2000. And this is an indication, in my judgment, that the court recognizes it's not just in this case concerning January 6th, but the one in Georgia, the one in New York, the one down Mar-a-Lago in Florida. Delay, delay, delay has been the tactic of the Trump defense team. They are hoping, obviously, to delay any verdict until after the 2024 elections, hoping that Mr. Trump could win. If he does that, he will dismiss the federal claims against him. And as a matter of state law, he will say, as long as I'm incumbent president, you can't prosecute me, so you can bring the prosecution in 2028. That has been the clear pattern that we've seen over and over again, appeals and delay. And the Supreme Court would be like Ichabod Crane, not seeing this pattern. They, my judgment, will take the case, as they had with Nixon before in the Nixon tapes case, and they did before in Bush v. Gore, and decide the case very rapidly. It really isn't all that novel of a question.
Let me follow up with this on this before I go back to Robert. As an experienced lawyer, what legal precedents do you believe are most relevant in the case against Hunter Biden, and how might they influence the trial?
On Hunter Biden?
Yes.
Well, I mean, if you don't file income tax returns, you're convicted of you're guilty. He has another trial, which he improperly refused to disclose that he was having drug treatment when he bought a gun. I do not believe that there's anything that's unique about his defense other than saying that the first plea bargain that he negotiated, which was rejected by the judge, and then the Department of Justice and Hunter Biden were unable to work out a successor plea bargain, was still binding. Now, the U.S. Supreme Court has held a case called Santabella in New York that once the government makes a deal, it's got to keep it. But this was a deal that was subject to the approval of the district court, said, no, I'm not going to buy in to this kind of resolution of the case. You remember it was criticized as a sweetheart deal. He wasn't going to spend any prison time, and moreover, he was going to get a guarantee that he wouldn't be prosecuted for acting as a foreign agent under a future administration. Judge said, I'm not buying into that. So, in my judgment, his defense is going to fail.
So, Robert, from a civil rights perspective, how do you view the media and public's reaction to Hunter Biden's case compared to similar cases involving less prominent individuals?
Well, I think many of these cases against Hunter Biden probably would not even be national attention if it was somebody less prominent than he. This question that he paid $1.4 million in taxes, which he says that he later paid back, that's an accounting issue. About 95% of those cases ended up either being dismissed or working their way up through plea deals during the normal course of business. You have President Trump, for example, who said that he has not paid taxes for decades at a time, and the number is going into the hundreds of millions of dollars. On the gun charge, as I said, that may or may not even be a constitutional violation which he has committed. So I think if you compare what Republicans claimed that these indictments would bring versus the reality of what they brought, Marjorie Taylor Greene showing revenge porn on the floor of the House of Representatives, conversations about human trafficking, the Epstein Island, all these things they claimed that they had evidence of, foreign contacts and et cetera around the globe, and to have a tax case and a gun case which may or may not even be which may be dismissed. I think that this is why you're seeing such low.
So Robert, in other words, this is a witch hunt. Hunter Biden should not be charged with anything, nor should. I'm just trying to figure out what you're really saying here. So Hunter Biden is innocent.
No, I don't care. I think.
Is he guilty of anything? Maybe guilty of anything? Should any charges have been filed against him?
The point I'm making is I do not care about Hunter Biden in the slightest.
But that's not what I'm asking you. These cases are being brought by a liberal state like California. Are there any allegations against him that's worthy of the Justice Department resources? Because this is a President Biden's Justice Department, and these are federal charges. And they don't usually bring these charges unless they've done their homework, Robert.
Exactly. And if he did not pay his taxes and didn't pay them back, then by all means prosecute him for doing that. I don't care what happens to Hunter Biden. What I will say is the majority of cases of this tax nature end up being settled or played out, and there's the open constitutional question about the gun charge. And I think for what Republicans built this up to be over the course of 5 or 6 years, this is a huge lead balloon. This is the Russia collusion investigation all over again, where it's just something that distracts the political parties in D.C., but the majority of American people can care less about.
So let me come back to you on this. What about Rudy Giuliani and the pay election workers in Georgia? They're about to confront each other. What are your thoughts?
I think Rudy Giuliani is about to come square on with Georgia justice. Now, I'm right here in Atlanta, and he very clearly violated these women's rights by going on television and defaming them, defaming their character, causing vigilantes to attempt to commit physical harm against these women. They had to go on the run and hide out to stop themselves from being potentially harmed by individuals who had listened to what Rudy Giuliani said, who believed that they were actually passing and hiding ballots, changing election results. I think Rudy Giuliani at one point said it looked like they were passing around crack or something along those lines when they were when she was really handing her daughter a piece of candy. So I'm hoping Giuliani is confronted with all the justice that he deserves, and that these women are able to proceed going forward, because they've not been able to find additional employment. Their work as poll workers, of course, they can't go back to doing that. He has ruined these women's lives based on nothing but lies for no good reason, and we have a legal system that addresses those issues.
And he's admitted to misleading the courts.
Exactly. Really, the biggest issue for Rudy Giuliani is he's admitted to everything he's accused of doing, and he's on video doing everything he's accused of doing. And I think it will be a very novel defense to find out what exactly his defense is to this, because in any other circumstance with this amount of evidence against you, you would have been trying to make a settlement agreement long before going to trial, because once you get to trial, you're not just facing your damages, you're also facing punitive damages and potentially anything else the court wants to levy upon you. We know that Rudy Giuliani has had financial issues, recently lost his law license. He's basically sustaining himself on his podcast and endorsements. So I will be interested to see what exactly his defense is going to trial.
Your voice, your future town hall. I'm Armstrong Williams, and we'll be back.
As a home buyer, you need a lender who cares about your home ownership dreams. United Security Financial has been helping families secure their dream homes for 30 years. We're a national fair practice lender that provides affordable mortgages and low down payment programs to eligible home buyers. To learn how United Security Financial can help you secure your dream home, call 1-800-373-4186.
And welcome back. Should the presidents of MIT and Harvard follow suit like the president of UPenn and resign?
No. I think that raising a hypothetical question with the presidents, Stefanik, the congresswoman, had not found, and the presidents didn't know of any student who ever called for the genocide of Jews. And in the abstract, the case law is quite clear. Famous case called Brandenburg versus Ohio, saying that even advocacy of violence is protected speech unless it's imminent likely to cause the violence to ensue. The First Amendment, according to the Supreme Court, protects speech that we hate, not just speech that we love. That doesn't mean you applaud that. And it also, I think, shows at least some lack of impartiality when I think all would agree that to call for the genocide of any group is horrendous, not just Jews. You call for genocide of Palestinians or Uyghurs, Biafrans, Tutus. It's terrible. I mean, genocide means you're trying to kill people because of, their religion, nationality, race, ethnicity. She just singled out one. It was hypothetical. And I think that as abhorrent as the speech is, that the best test of the truth is more speech, better speech, not expelling them and trying to create an attitude of a pall of orthodoxy, if you will. It reminds me a little bit of all the associations that led to expulsions and resignations at the time of Joe McCarthy. You had lunch with a communist, or even someone like Oppenheimer lost his security clearance. He attended one communist meeting when he was a youth. And we had at that time, you may recall, a very famous newsman, Edward R. Murrow, said, no, we're not going down that road. When there's actual incitement, harassment, harm, of course, you take action about it. But just ideas in the abstract, yes, in the abstract, we do tolerate ideas that we hate.
Robert, what are your thoughts on the Biden impeachment inquiry gaining traction in the House?
I think this is the best thing that could happen for Joe Biden. I think that what this will do is give an opportunity for the American people to see the abject lunacy of the House of Representatives. Let's understand, they will go nowhere. We have a Democratic Senate. There will never be a removal of President Biden. Once Kevin McCarthy steps down at the end of this year, Republicans will have a 2-vote majority. There's a very good chance that they would not even be able to pass it or to pass an impeachment resolution. However, what this inquiry will show is just to severe dearth of evidence the Republicans have. It will put on display the clown show they've been running. That when you're having the federal government that's about to shut down in January, and then the second half to shut down in February, and you have Republicans running around doing this while the Americans are out of jobs or not able to make bill payments, and you have these massive foreign policy issues that have to be dealt with in Ukraine and Israel, the southern border, etc. I think it's going to show the American people exactly the reason Joe Biden is the stable leader that we need right now.
Bruce, I must have you respond for the first time on the show. Please.
Well, I surely don't think that an impeachment resolution will show that Joe Biden is a stable leader. I think he's been an irresponsible leader. I think he's been very, very weak, at least with regard to his response, to the unfortunate ongoing war in Hamas, Israel, Gaza. He runs over to Israel, and he's like Henry IV at Canossa to Netanyahu. He looks very, very, very weak. He's unable to get his policies through on Ukraine. He had his Secretary of Defense, I think Armstrong knows that, brief Congress, say, if you don't give Mr. Biden the money he wants on Ukraine, we're going to have soldiers on the ground fighting in NATO
your fathers,
countries.
your uncles, your brothers.
Yeah.
Blood.
Because Putin will be emboldened to attack of all of NATO countries and clearly threat inflation in order to overcome his lack of ability to convince Congress that really the fate of democracy in the world lies in Ukraine and Kiev. No, I think Biden is floundering. And he looks mummified, and the impeachment resolution is not going to help him out. I think he's his own worst enemy, and he doesn't have a crowd around him that has any coherent policy. Inflation's rising. We have carrying costs on the national debt approaching $1 trillion or more. So, no, Mr. Biden is not going to be helped.
Robert, there is no plan to adopt climate change. The UN talks just totally collapse.
And this is one of the, well, first I want to respond to a couple things. One, inflation is down 64% from its peak in 2021. We've seen 11 consecutive months from the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act of inflation reduction. Employment's at 3.7%. We added 200,000 jobs last month. If you're talking about President Biden, his response to the Israel-Hamas conflict, he's the first president to go to Israel during a time of war to stand up for a wartime ally. And it is House Republicans who are blocking the $15 billion in aid that President Biden has requested to help Israel actually prosecute the war. And when you were talking about this conceptualization of Russia barreling through Ukraine, we've seen the battle plans they have to go directly through Kherson to take the port of Odessa and then to move into Transnistria, which is part of Moldova, to free quote-unquote Russian separatists there. Moldova and Romania will be the next targets in line for Putin if Ukraine falls. This has been part of Putin's plan from the beginning of rebuilding that bloc to stop the Northern European pathway to have a direct line of invasion for Russia. So there's no fear-mongering here. This is simply a statement of the reality, and Republicans cannot simply wait until the tanks are rolling into Romania and Article 5 is triggered to actually find the time to do something about American foreign policy. Imagine President Reagan standing here and looking at Republicans in 2023 saying they don't want to fund a fight to stop Russia from expanding eastward. Now, on this climate issue, President Biden has made it very clear through the Build Back Better bill that America's investing in green energy. However, what we're seeing is globally, we are not taking the issue of climate change seriously. I'm not quite sure exactly how many scientific papers have to be published, how much research needs to be done, how many islands need to be flooded for the world to take this as a serious issue. But until we do, we're going to continue to see coastlines be destroyed, small nations be completely submerged underneath. And if you're not going, and I think most importantly, we have to get countries like India and China to do their part on this, because China's building more coal power plants than any other part of the world. But if we're not taking this seriously as a global issue, we will all perish together as a global community for corporate profits.
Let me respond in part. First of all, you sound like the domino theory, this threat inflation that suddenly Putin, who's struggling in Ukraine, he's hardly able to keep Chechnya in balance. He has very little money. He has to kill the head of Wagner Group because he's on such shaky ground politically, and that he's got a plan to invade all of Western Europe. We have plans probably to invade the whole world. That's what militaries do. They create plans. Executing them is close to zero. There's, I think, an absurd inflation, of the danger. And they can't make the case on the merits, so they try to invent these catastrophes. It reminds me of the Suez Crisis of '56. The British Prime Minister said if we didn't get rid of Nasser, Western civilization would collapse because he had nationalized the Suez Canal. So I just think that's an absurd echo of the military-industrial complex that wants to create wars so they get more money, more weapons that they can sell, and keep their 800 military bases abroad. With regard to the economy, I was talking about the interest rates. You know, I think you're now paying 7-8% on mortgage rates, which people care about, which is a double, triple what it was years ago. Interest, I mean, the inflation is down front. It leapt up under the watch of Joe Biden, not anyone else. With regard to climate change, I think you're trying to impose, you know, kind of an absolute goal when we have balances at stake. If all of these greenhouse methods of energy were cost efficient, you wouldn't need all of these international conferences and subsidies and government interventions in the marketplace to try to foist green technology on the consumer. It's trade-off. You cost more, then you have less of money to buy food, have electricity, heat, and all sorts of other things. And the reason why the countries aren't leaping forward to embrace all the green technology, and I suppose you could probably eliminate greenhouse gas emissions if you're willing to spend all of your resources on that and nothing else, is because people have a lot of hardships that they confront. Climate change is just one of them. They suffer from medical problems, they need economic aid, there's food crisis in many places in the world, not because of climate change, but they don't even have the transportation to get to the food the places they need. So I think what we're seeing in regard to the climate issue is just a balance like everything else. One is a trade-off against another, and each country is going to make its own trade-off. There's not going to be any international system that's going to cram down an international climate change down another country's throat. And we're not going to war to force China to burn less coal. It's not going to happen. China's going to make its own decision.
Robert, in 45 seconds, the state Supreme Court of Texas temporarily blocked the abortion procedure, and the lady that was trying to pursue an abortion left the state. Do you think that the GOP is still missing out on a very important issue as it relates to women voters across the country?
I think they are, and I'm a pro-life voter. I think that there's very much a way to craft a strategy which is not punitive towards women. I think it has to be a strategy which is dedicated towards the whole life of the child, provide the resources that we will make abortion obsolete. But what we're creating now is a half the country which is an abortion half and half which is a non-abortion half, and it's a not a tenable position for the GOP.
You know, I cannot thank both of you for always coming on our platforms. Of course, you're two of my favorites. I think it's important to hear both sides. I don't think anybody should hear opinions in isolation. And one of the things that we try to do with Your Voice, Your Future, because it is your voice and it is your future, and people really need to understand the issues fiercely debated with compassion, but with civility and respect. And you, both you gentlemen certainly represent the best of that in this country, and I can never thank you enough for continuing to come to our platform to educate and inform our listeners. Thank you so much for joining this edition of Your Voice, Your Future. I'm your host, Armstrong Williams.